Our gospel reading this morning comes from Mark's gospel, very near the beginning of that book, a book written somewhere around 65 CE or so, some 35 years after the death of Jesus. Hear these words. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And the Spirit immediately drove Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God, and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard and the spaces in between affirm us and empower us. Amen. Over the decades, one of the most popular magazines in America has been the Reader's Digest. It was always something of a potpourri, featuring abridged articles from a variety of sources and regular features like "Laughter is the Best Medicine," humorous short vignettes submitted by readers, and "My Most Unforgettable Character," stories written in the first person recounting various authors' encounters with people who had made a real impact on their lives. The digest was always popular bathroom reading. Partly, I'm sure, because most of the articles were very short, and partly because it always fit just right on the back of your toilet. The digest also published a series of hardbacks called Reader's Digest Condensed Books. Usually published on a quarterly basis, each volume featured 5 or so abridged versions of popular novels, biographies, and occasional works of nonfiction. The condensed books were published between 1950 and 1998 and included works by well-known authors like James Michener, Pearl S. Buck, Herman Wouk, and even Winston Churchill. When I was in seminary, I worked for 2 summers at a residence camp in Maine as the director of fine arts. It was a girls' camp, and as a result, most of the other members of the staff were young women. I was married, and my wife was far away along with all my friends. So after my duties were completed, I spent most of my evenings curled up in my room with a book. That first summer, I found a whole stash of those condensed books in the tiny camp library. And so I read many volumes of those abridged books. The reality is the abridgments were very focused on plot and left out things like character development and lengthy descriptions of time and place. Reading them made my lonely nights bearable, but I can't honestly say I can remember even one title of the books I read those 2 summers. Our passage from Mark is something of a Reader's Digest version of the opening days of Jesus' public ministry. One can't help but think Mark must know a whole lot more than what he's actually conveying in these few verses about the call, the baptism, and the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. But that said, this passage is very true to form, for Mark is always short and to the point. Indeed, his is the shortest of the canonical 4 Gospels. His story barely stretches to 16 chapters, while the other 3 are all well in excess of 20 chapters. Mark, you see, has a story to tell. He announces that right up front at the beginning, and he wants to tell it quickly, without distractions. Reader, you need to hear what I have to say because this is the gospel. This is good news. And the punchline, well, the punchline comes at the end. My protagonist, this Jesus of Nazareth, he's going to be put to death, and then he's going to be raised from the dead, but we can't get to that part until I give you some background. So here we go. And immediately, Mark is off and running. Indeed, one of his very favorite words is eutheos, often translated immediately. It occurs 40 times in this brief gospel and is usually used to move things along. Jesus does or says something, and then, rather than dwell on it, Mark inserts the word eutheos, and immediately we go on to the next thing. It happens twice in our brief passage this morning. In verse 10, after Jesus is immersed in the water by John the Baptizer and starts to emerge from the Jordan, eutheos, immediately. Jesus has a vision of the heavens opening up, a dove descending, a voice saying, "This is my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." And then, barely giving Jesus enough time to wring out his robe and towel off his body, Mark's sense of urgency strikes again. Eutheos, he writes, immediately, God's Spirit leads him into the wilderness where he is tempted by Satan, surrounded by wild beasts, and waited on by angels. Eutheos. Immediately. And that's it. In Mark, we don't get the protracted dialogue between Jesus and the devil that we find in the Gospels written by Matthew and Luke. There's no mention of turning stones into bread like we heard about in that opening hymn. No temptation to become king of the world. No talk of climbing up to the top of the temple and seeing if God will save him from hitting the ground when he jumps off. None of that. Just a few short words. Tempted by Satan, surrounded by beasts, waited on by angels. Which leaves a whole lot to imagination. Just like those condensed books used to do. Just what did happen during those 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness? Over the centuries, scholars and commentators have often offered up elaborate theological interpretations, often pointing to the parallels between the 40 days Jesus spends in the wilderness and the 40 years the Israelites spent wandering through the desert after their escape from Egypt. All of which is logical, meaningful. After all, it makes sense that Mark would want to tie the story of the Jewish Jesus into the wider story of God's relationship to the Jewish people. But most of us here are not Jewish. And we certainly don't live in the first century. And while we understand the importance of grounding the story of Jesus in the history and culture of his people, in the history and culture of Judaism, we also want to take something more from this story than a mere academic lesson. How, we want to know, how does this story help us as we deal with temptations that we face in our lives? How does it help us deal with the figurative wild beasts that we face every single day? And how, in heaven's name, can we get in on some of that angelic comfort? Please, Jesus. The answer, I think, rests in slowing things down a bit and not getting caught up in Mark's sense of urgency. The answer rests in scrolling back, so to speak. Scrolling back to the details of the baptism, those details that come before these few words about the time in the desert. Stop and think about it. Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan, and he's told by God that he is loved. With you I am well pleased, says God. In and through his baptism, Jesus is affirmed by the Holy One. He is reminded that he is accepted just as he is. This comes, remember, at the very beginning of his ministry. He's not done anything to win God's approval. He's not performed any healing miracles. He's not delivered any sermons on the Mount or anywhere else for that matter. He hasn't even gotten on Rome's radar screen yet, much less been tortured and crucified. He's just Jesus, just plain old Jesus. And God is well pleased. It seems to me that one of the things that Mark's condensed version of these stories can help us remember is simply this. God is pleased with who Jesus is just because he's Jesus. And because of that, Jesus is prepared to face the temptation, that great temptation that many of us face, to be someone other than who he is. Jesus is empowered to take on his own mission. Now, whether you want to wrestle with what Mark means by the word Satan, I think it's fair to assume that when Jesus goes in the wilderness to fast, to pray, to meditate, to just plain think, he must be assaulted by the same inner voices that we are. Inner voices that tell him he's worthless. Inner voices that say, you just don't really measure up, Jesus. You can't possibly carry out this mission. You're really not good enough for it, Jesus. After all, you're just a carpenter from Nazareth. Lowly Nazareth. Nothing good comes from Sanibel, Nazareth. You don't come from Jerusalem or New York or Moscow or Beijing, Jesus. You come from Nazareth. What can you possibly know about being the Messiah? You see, I'm convinced that Jesus faced the same wild beasts, those same inner voices, those same doubts and fears that you and I face every day if we're honest about it. Those niggling worries that you are just not capable of being a good enough spouse. Those inner concerns that you just don't really measure up when it comes to being a good parent or a good son or a good daughter. Those negative assessments of your own ability to make any difference in the societal struggles over guns or race or poverty. If only I were better looking or more successful or stronger or younger or older or smarter or richer. If only I were well connected or held public office then. If only I were different, then maybe then I'd be acceptable. You and I understand fully what Henri Nouwen means when he writes, as soon as someone accuses me or criticizes me, I find myself thinking, well, that proves once again that I am a nobody. But God says no. You are not a nobody. You are you. And I accept you, says God. I love you, just as you are. Remember that. When those worries, those doubts, those fears start to attack you, remember what I've said. You are my beloved son, my beloved daughter, my beloved child. I love you as you are. I accept you. And I long for you to accept yourself. For when you do, my child, you will discover a measure of peace, a measure of serenity, and it will feel like my angels are attending to your very soul. I've known used book dealers who refuse to put those Reader's Digest condensed books on consignment. They just can't seem to sell them. They just collect dust like all the old National Geographics. Maybe it's because of all that they leave out of the stories they relate. But the Bible continues to be the all-time bestseller, and Mark's Gospel, one of its most popular books. Maybe that's because Mark leaves out details, but in doing so, he allows us to fill them in. He allows us to recognize ourselves in the story. He allows us to realize that just like Jesus, you and I are beloved children of God. And that's not the Reader's Digest version. That's the gospel truth.